There are things a mother says to her child that are meant for no one else. Not for history, not for the record, not for the world that had spent the better part of a decade pressing its face against the glass of that family's private life, hungry for every fragment, every detail, every unguarded moment that might make the extraordinary feel ordinary, or the ordinary feel extraordinary. Just for the child. Said in the register that only a mother and her child share, something below the public frequency, something that carries no ceremony, no performance, no awareness of being observed. The words that exist only between two people, in the specific warmth of a relationship that has its own language, its own shorthand, its own accumulated history of small moments that mean nothing to anyone outside them and everything to the people inside. Diana understood this distinction better than almost anyone who has ever lived a public life. She had been watched since she was 19 years old. The watching had been relentless and, by any honest assessment, frequently cruel. The kind of sustained public scrutiny that reshapes a person from the outside in, that makes self-consciousness a permanent condition, that turns even the most private moments into something you are half aware might be seen. She had spoken about this, in the years before she died, with a candor that shocked people not because it was exaggerated, but because it was precise. She knew exactly what had been done to her, and she could describe it with a clarity that left no room for comfortable denial. And so she had learned, with great care and over a long time, to protect the things that were real, the interior things, the things that lived beyond the reach of cameras and reporters and the institutional machinery that managed every other aspect of her existence. She knew which moments were genuinely hers, and she guarded them, fiercely, with the particular ferocity of someone who has had most things taken and who holds what remains with both hands. When she left a message, when she sat somewhere quiet and picked up a phone and spoke into it, she was speaking in that register. The private one, the one reserved for the people she loved in the daily, unremarkable, entirely unperformed way that the public version of her life rarely allowed. She was not Princess of Wales in those moments. She was a mother, talking to her son. In the specific voice you use when you are not performing anything for anyone, when you are simply reaching towards someone you love across whatever distance has temporarily separated you. What she could not have known, in that moment, was how long the words would wait. What she could not have imagined was the particular journey those words would take, through decades and through loss and through the gradual, painful reorganization of everything that had surrounded her, before they finally arrived at the person they were always intended for. Before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. What you are hearing is commentary and informed analysis, built on documented royal history and the kind of careful, considered speculation that serious students of this family engage in when the official record falls silent, as it almost always does, where the private lives of these people are concerned. This is not a transcript. It is not a confirmed account provided by anyone who was present. The palace does not speak about the interior life of the family it represents, and it never has, and it never will. But the shape of what happened, the broad outline, the emotional architecture of it, the effect it produced on the people involved, has made its way, through the particular channels by which private knowledge travels in closed circles, into the understanding of those who watch this family most closely. That is what we are working from here, the shape, what it reveals, and what it means. Now, let us talk about William. There is a version of Prince William that the world has come to know across the decades of his public life. The composed version. The steady one. The man who has learned, through years of the most sustained and invasive public scrutiny that any human being can experience outside of active conflict, to present a face that gives very little away. Engaged but not exposed, present but not permeable. The face of a man who is always doing the work of the moment, always meeting the requirement of the occasion, always giving the watching world enough to read as warmth and accessibility and genuine engagement, while keeping the interior, the real interior, the place where the actual experience of being William lives, entirely sealed. He has been criticized for this, called stiff, called cold, compared, unfavorably and repeatedly, to his mother, who wore her interior on the outside, who made vulnerability a form of communication, who seemed constitutionally incapable of performing an emotion she wasn't actually feeling. These comparisons are not fair to William, and they are not accurate, and the people who make them most confidently are usually the people who understand him least, because what looks like coldness in William is not the absence of feeling. It is the presence of enormous feeling, held under enormous pressure, by a man who learned at 15 years old what happens when you lose control of it in a world that is always watching. He was 15 when she died. That fact deserves to sit here for a moment, without being rushed past. 15, still a child by any measure that matters, still in the process of becoming, of assembling, from the raw material of genetics and experience and relationship and environment, the person he was going to be. And into that process, into the open and unfinished construction of a self, came August 1997. Came the phone call in the night. Came the information that rearranged everything. Not just the facts of his life, but the emotional landscape of it. The ground under everything else. The foundation on which whatever he was going to build would have to stand. He has spoken about this period rarely and carefully. There was the interview with his brother, in the documentary made to mark the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, where both of them described the experience of not talking about her for years, of the grief going underground, of the absence being managed through silence rather than expression, of the cost of that silence arriving, eventually, in ways they hadn't anticipated. William described the moment, some years after her death, when he began to understand that the not talking was itself a problem, that the containment had become its own kind of damage. He sought help. He has said this publicly, with the particular courage it takes for a man in his position to say it publicly. He began, at some point in his adult life, the work of actually processing what he had been carrying since he was 15. The grief that had been managed rather than felt. The loss that had been administered rather than mourned. It is work that therapists will tell you never really ends, that it shifts and changes and becomes more manageable over time, but that it does not resolve in the way that problems resolve. It becomes something you have learned to live alongside rather than something you have gotten past. And it was into this, into the ongoing, managed, carefully maintained equilibrium of a man who has been doing that work for years, that the voicemail arrived. The device was old, not ancient, not a museum piece, but the kind of old that technology becomes when it has been superseded by successive generations of something better and has been left behind, not because it failed, but simply because the world moved on. An answering machine. The kind of device that was everywhere in the mid-1990s, that sat on side tables and in home offices and in the private apartments of people who needed to receive messages when they were unavailable. That held those messages physically, in the machine, locally, not connected to any larger system, not backed up anywhere, not existing in any form outside the specific object itself. It had been stored. In a box, in a room, in one of the residences that form the distributed geography of the royal family's private life, the official ones and the less official ones, the properties that are managed institutionally and the ones that are more quietly personal, the spaces that accumulate the physical residue of lives lived across decades without ever quite making it through the regular auditing that keeps large estates from disappearing under their own history. It had been there for a long time, long enough that the people who might have known about it, who might have dealt with it intentionally, had either forgotten or moved past the point where dealing with it was something they were going to do. It was found during a process of going through things. The specific kind of going through that happens in large families when properties are being reviewed, when generations are shifting, and the practical administration of inherited spaces arrives, inevitably, and without much ceremony, at objects that have sat undisturbed for long enough that their moment of disturbance has finally come. Someone found it, someone who understood, immediately, that what they were holding was not theirs to open or to assess or to make decisions about. It was passed on, carefully, through the chain of trust and proximity that governs how sensitive things move within this family, until it reached someone who could determine what to do with it. And eventually, through a sequence of decisions made by people who understood what they were handling and why it mattered, it reached William. He received it on an ordinary afternoon. That detail is important, and it is one of the details that those with knowledge of this situation have been most consistent about conveying. There was no preparation for it. No one had called ahead to say, something significant is coming, brace yourself, make sure you are somewhere private and supported when this arrives. because no one fully knew what was on the device until it was played. The people who passed it to him knew it was Diana's. They did not know what it contained, and so it arrived the way the most significant things in life almost always arrive, without warning, without the mercy of expectation, in the middle of an afternoon that had given no indication of being anything other than ordinary. He was alone with it. In a room, by himself, with the device and whatever technology was needed to play it, in the specific privacy that he had ensured around this moment once he understood what he was holding. Whether Catherine was in the house, whether anyone else was nearby, belongs to the private geography of his life and his home. What matters is that in the moment of hearing it, he was as alone as circumstances allowed. He heard her voice. "I want to stay here for a moment, because this deserves more than being moved past quickly, in the interest of narrative momentum. Think about what it means to hear the voice of someone you loved and lost. Not a public recording, not an interview clip, not the voice that existed for the cameras and the microphones and the official occasions. A private voice, casual, unguarded. The voice of someone speaking in the specific frequency of a relationship that belongs entirely to the two people inside it, using the shorthand and the warmth and the particular rhythms of communication that exist only between a mother and her child. Diana's voice speaking directly to her son, the son who was, when this message was left, still a child living in the world in which she was alive, still in the world where she could be called, where she would pick up, where a message left for her would be heard by her and responded to. A world that ended on the 31st of August, 1997, and that William has been living in the aftermath of ever since. The specific content of what she said, the actual words, the sentences, what she was calling about, and what she wanted him to know, belongs to him. It will not be speculated about here in any specific way, because that speculation would be an intrusion into something that is genuinely, irreducibly private, and because the specifics are ultimately less important than the fact of it. What matters is not what she said, exactly. What matters is that she said it. That her voice existed in that machine, unchanged across the decades, exactly as she had left it, casual, loving, entirely unaware of the distance it would travel before it was heard. What the message produced, the effect of it on a man who has spent his adult life building the architecture of composure that his public role requires, is something that has been understood, in its broad outlines, by those who know him and who were close enough to observe him in the hours and days that followed. And by every available account, it was devastating. Not in a visible, external sense, not in any form the world could have seen or photographed, but in the interior sense, in the sense of something reaching past all the carefully constructed management and landing directly on the wound that has always been there, the one that preceded all the construction, the one that the construction was built specifically to protect. Those who know William well describe what happens to him when Diana surfaces unexpectedly, when something connected to her arrives without preparation, without the buffer that planned memorials and official anniversaries provide. They describe a specific quality of stillness. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a man in whom everything has suddenly gone very quiet because something very loud has happened internally, and the interior noise is using up all the available resources, leaving nothing for the exterior. The face becomes more controlled, paradoxically, in exactly the moments when the interior is least controlled. The expression closes down. The eyes become very steady, and to someone who doesn't know him, this reads as composure. To someone who does, it reads as something else entirely. Catherine knew. She always knows. She has been present for enough of these moments across the years of their marriage, the unexpected photographs, the documentaries, the anniversaries that hit harder than anticipated, the conversations with people who knew Diana and who sometimes say things that land in ways no one intended, that she has developed a sensitivity to this specific signal that is almost cellular in its precision. She does not need him to tell her. She reads it in the room, in the particular quality of his silence, in the way he occupies space differently when he is carrying something this specific. She did not ask him immediately what the message had said. She understood that the message was his, that its contents belonged to the relationship between a mother and her son, and that her role in this moment was not to have access to those contents, but to be present for the person who did. She stayed close. She was available. She made herself a constant, steady presence in the background of those hours without requiring anything from him. not explanation, not processing done aloud, not the performance of being okay that partners sometimes need from each other, simply because the ongoing uncertainty is its own kind of strain. She gave him the space to hold it, and she held the space while he did. This is one of the things that those who know them most closely describe as the particular and specific strength of their partnership. Catherine's capacity to be steady in the moments that require steadiness, without making that steadiness about her own need to do something useful. She does not try to fix. She does not move toward resolution before the person she loves is ready for resolution. She stays. It was during this period, while William was still in the interior of what the voicemail had opened, that the other thing arrived. Anne had found the ring. The two events did not happen simultaneously. They were separate discoveries, arriving through separate channels, separated by enough time that each had begun to settle before the other landed, but not separated by enough time that either had been fully processed. Not enough distance between them for the absorption of one to be complete before the arrival of the other began. And the result of that proximity, of the voicemail and the ring arriving within the same window of William's emotional life, one on top of the other, before the defenses that the first had lowered had been fully rebuilt, was something cumulative and compounding in a way that neither event alone would have produced. Think carefully about the sequence. He had just heard his mother's voice. He had been returned, without warning, to the reality of her, not the icon, not the legacy, not the carefully managed historical figure whose memory is tended with such institutional deliberateness. The real her, the private her, the woman who had called him on a regular phone and left a message in the entirely ordinary way that mothers leave messages for their children, not knowing that the message would outlast her by decades and arrive at her son in a world she never got to see. He was in that state, open in a way he is very rarely open, exposed in a way that the architecture of his adult life is specifically designed to prevent, when the information about the ring reached him. That something of Diana's had been found in Camilla's private quarters. That Anne, who had found it, had recognized it with absolute certainty, not from a photograph or a catalog, but from a specific, embodied memory of Diana wearing it. That Anne had gone directly to Charles, and that Charles had not explained it, had not produced the simple, innocent account that would have existed if a simple, innocent account were available, had instead gone silent in a way that his sister, who has known him for his entire life, had found more alarming than any explanation could have been. The ring reached William in the form of information passed carefully through the channels that exist within this family for the movement of things too significant for casual communication. Who told him first, in what form, with what context and what framing, this belongs to the private knowledge of those involved. What is understood is that he received it, and that he received it here, in this state, while he was still living in the raw emotional aftermath of hearing her voice. If the ring had arrived at any ordinary moment in William's life, the impact would have been substantial. He carries everything connected to Diana in a register that is never neutral, never merely informational. But it arrived now, into the specific tenderness of a man who had just been returned to his mother in the most direct and intimate possible way, and who was therefore less defended than usual against the particular grief and anger that anything suggesting she had been wronged, that anything suggesting the settled version of events was not the true one, inevitably produces. He did not erupt. Of course he didn't. The control is too structural for that, too thoroughly built into the foundation of who he is, too deeply continuous with every decision he has ever made about how to occupy his position and his life. But those who were close enough to observe him in those days describe a quality to him that was different, a compression, something that was pressing against the usual containment from the inside in a way that was visible to the people who knew what to look for, even though it produced nothing visible to anyone else. He went quiet. Not in the ordinary way he is sometimes quiet, not the measured, purposeful quiet of a man thinking through something before he speaks, a different kind, the kind that those who love him have learned to be attentive to, the kind that means the interior work is happening at a depth and intensity that has temporarily made the exterior go still. Catherine saw it. She adjusted. She moved closer without moving obviously closer, made herself more present without announcing the presence, created the conditions in which he could speak when he was ready to speak, without creating any pressure toward readiness. She is extraordinarily skilled at this. It is not a small thing, and it is not something that comes without cost to the person doing it. The sustained attentiveness, the constant management of your own needs in order to be available for someone else's, the work of being a steady place for a person who is going through something that you can only partially understand because the loss at the center of it is not yours. She has her own relationship to Diana's memory, and it is one that is rarely given sufficient attention. She did not know Diana. She married William when Diana had been gone for more than a decade, and she came into a family still organized, in its private emotional life, around an absence that shaped everything without ever being fully named. She has raised 3 children for whom Diana is a grandmother they will never meet, a presence they know through photographs and stories, and the particular care that William takes to keep her real for them, to make her more than an official portrait on a wall. She has spoken carefully about this, about the effort to make Diana present for George and Charlotte and Louis in a way that is honest and loving, and not complicated by any of the institutional history that surrounds Diana's name. The idea that something of Diana's had been sitting in Camilla's private quarters, not stored, not documented, not held in any of the formal ways that significant items are held, but simply present as though it belonged there, reached Catherine with its own specific weight. She did not receive it as a detached observer. She received it as the woman who was raising Diana's grandchildren, as someone who had spent years thinking carefully about what Diana's memory meant and how to honor it, as someone for whom the integrity of that memory was not an abstract concern, but a daily, practical one. William called his father, not immediately. The decision to call, the preparation for what he needed to say, and how he needed to say it, took time. This is not a man who picks up the phone in the heat of the moment and says things that the heat of the moment has generated. The control extends to this. To the management of significant conversations, to the understanding that what gets said between them, in the private register of their actual relationship, cannot be unsaid, and that therefore what gets said had better be what he actually means, rather than what the feeling of the moment is producing. The conversation that followed belongs entirely to the private world of those 2 men. No transcript exists. No account of it will ever be officially provided. But the broad shape of it, the emotional territory it covered, the questions it raised, and whether those questions received answers, the state of things between them when it ended, has been understood, in its outline, by those close enough to observe its effects. Charles was not, by the account of those who know him in his private mode, unaffected. He is a man who carries the history of his first marriage with a heaviness that has never fully lifted, a weight that is made up of guilt and grief and love and self-justification and all the complex, contradictory things that are involved in any marriage's failure, magnified to an almost unimaginable degree by the public nature of this particular failure and the particular nature of Diana's death. He does not speak of it directly. He does not, in any public forum or private gathering that has been observed, allow himself to be returned to it in any sustained or open way. The management of it is too necessary, the consequences of allowing it to surface too difficult to control. But William is not the public. William is his son. And William was asking him, in the controlled, quiet, entirely undramatic way that this family conducts its most serious conversations, to account for something that did not have a clean account available. What he offered, the response that Charles produced to the questions William was putting to him, was not adequate. That much is understood by those who know what the conversation produced in the relationship between them. Not a confession of anything specific, not a revelation, but also not the clear, complete, entirely innocent explanation that would have existed if that explanation were available. What Charles offered was something in the territory of the partial, enough to technically constitute a response, not enough to constitute an answer. And William, who had come to that conversation with enough understanding of the situation to know the difference, received it as what it was. The thing about the relationship between William and Charles, and this is something that has been true for a long time, that precedes the voicemail and the ring and everything that this particular period produced, is that it operates on 2 distinct frequencies simultaneously. There is the public frequency, the visible relationship of a king and his heir, managed with care and presented with appropriate warmth, supporting the institutional narrative of a dynasty in healthy transition. And there is the private frequency, the actual relationship between a father and a son, in the room where the performance stops and the history lives. These 2 frequencies have not always been in alignment. They have been, at various points and for various reasons, significantly out of alignment. And the work of maintaining the public frequency when the private one is under strain is work that costs something. It costs something every time. The voicemail had lowered William's defenses in a way that was specific and deep. It had returned him to the undefended version of himself, to the interior of the boy who had lost her, the boy who had been present for everything that her marriage had been and everything it had failed to be, the boy who had loved his mother with the uncomplicated wholeness of a child's love and had watched that love be contextualized, over the years, by everything he came to understand about what had been done to her. And from that undefended place, Charles's partial answer had not been enough. It is not enough to say what comes of this. The word resolution, in the context of this family's relationship with Diana's memory, with each other, with the history that binds them all, that word belongs to a category of things that may never fully apply. What there is instead is continuation, the ongoing, imperfect, frequently painful process of a family that carries more than most families carry, managing it in the ways available to them, making the accommodations that daily life requires, and living within the tension between what is known privately and what is said publicly as best they can. William will be king. He has always known this. He has been preparing for it in every choice he has made about who to be, what to stand for, how to occupy the role that is coming toward him, with the inevitability of something that was decided before he was born. And one of the things that can be read clearly in the accumulated record of his public choices and his stated priorities, and the causes he has aligned himself with, and the way he has spoken, on the rare occasions when he has spoken with any candor about his own experience, is that he intends to be honest in a way that the institution has not historically rewarded or encouraged. Diana's voice, speaking to him across decades, is part of the inheritance he is reckoning with. The ring in the drawer is part of it. His father's silence, the partial, insufficient response to the question that the ring made unavoidable, is part of it. They are all pieces of the same thing, the complicated, unresolved, living history of a family that is also an institution, trying to be honest about what it is while maintaining the public version of itself that the institution requires. The tension between those two things has always been the defining tension of this family. It is the tension that Diana named most openly and that no one since has been willing or able to name as clearly. And it is the tension that William will inherit, along with everything else, when the crown passes. Whether he can resolve it, whether the private truth and the public presentation can be brought into closer alignment than they have ever been, whether the things that have been managed in silence can be transformed into something more honest without destroying the institution in the process, that is the question that all of this leaves open. It is, finally, the question that all of the significant private moments in this family's history leave open, the question that the voicemail opens, that the ring opens, that the silence from Charles opens. There is something in Diana's voice, speaking to a child who is now a man approaching middle age, that makes the question more urgent than it might otherwise be. Because she asked, in the directest possible way and at significant personal cost, for honesty. She asked for it publicly, in the Panorama interview that the institution tried and failed to prevent, speaking with a precision about what had been done to her that left no room for comfortable reinterpretation. And she asked for it privately, in the conversations with her sons, in the way she raised them to be different from the institution that had formed them, in the hope she expressed, in various ways and in various contexts, that the next generation might be braver about the truth than her own had been. William heard her voice on an ordinary afternoon. He heard it speak to him in the private register, the one that belongs only to them, the one that carries no performance and no management and no institutional weight. And he heard it in the specific state of a man who was already, because of everything else that was happening, at the edge of the containment he has spent his adult life building. What it broke open in him, what it released, what it clarified, what decisions it may have moved him toward or away from, lives in the sealed interior that is his alone. But something shifted. In a family where shifts happen slowly and quietly and are almost never announced, something shifted. The thread moved. We will be watching when it moves again. Stay close.